I am Andrea Cooper,
And I am Willa Blitzer.
reporting live from Studio 2U in Anderson Plaza.
On today's breaking report of Cultures of Corruption TV, we have eyes on the ground of American University's campus.
Oh, are we going to be talking about the university's reports and covering up the reports of molded mice?
Oh no, that'll be discussed on Thursday night's segment. Everyone at home, tune in at 9/8 Central for more on that story. Today, we'll be focusing on the students' own perceptions of corruption.
All right, we've got our correspondent, Nick Sinopoli, on the ground.
On to you, Nick.
Thanks, guys. I'm Nick Sinopoli, reporting for Cultures of Corruption TV. Today, we're on American University's campus, and we're going to be talking to the brightest minds here about what their definition of corruption is. Let's go. So today, we're going to be asking people what their definition of corruption is, what are some sources of corruption, and how we can change corruption and make the world a better place. Let's go.
So I would say corruption is misuse of money specifically. And so sources of that, I would say money. Yeah. And then lack of oversight and lack of accountability. So those could be solutions. And the accountability in governments or whatever.
I would say that corruption is the abuse of power, and ways that it can be abused is through money or through mismanagement or just even lying. And so ways to fix that could be oversight, organization, and
Perfect. So what is your definition of corruption?
So I think corruption is when the public funds are not distributed in their correct way, and usually happens when government officials, when in my case, in my terms, is when government officials don't use them properly. And that usually happens, the sources of the corruptions are usually when there is lack of transparency or quality controls, internal controls in the government or among officials. Yeah.
Perfect. And what are some ways we can reduce corruption?
So one of the way is to improve auditing services for the government, for example, to increase transparency of how the monies are spent in the government. Another way is more active citizenship, so people know and are actively engaged in how their public funds are spent. Yeah.
So now that we have talked to American University's brightest, we're going to take it back to the studio to find out the real definition of corruption. This has been Corruption TV. Guys, back to you in the studio.
Thank you for that report, Nick. It's quite intriguing to hear about what the students think of corruption. What's your take on it, Willa Blitzer? I know you've done quite a bit of research on it.
Yes, I remember back before my extensive studies of corruption, I was in their shoes. If I had someone come up to me asking what I thought caused corruption, I would have no idea how to answer. I thought that corruption was something that was exclusively present in governmental organizations and really only pertained to financial issues. I did not realize how widespread this issue was and how detrimental it is for a society.
In the beginning, I too had quite a narrow idea of what corruption was and how to deal with it. This is in part due to the fact that, I didn't really think about corruption as often as I do now, reporting about it every day and whatnot. But I also did not fully grasp the extent of its effects and how deep corruption could go in a society. In uni, I took a very interesting course on corruption. And we had extensive discussions on the topic. And one thing that really stuck with me was when Frank Vogel, co-founder of Transparency International and author, came to speak to us and said to us that corruption is really more of a contributor and not a sole cause. And so it has to be looked at in conjunction with other things. Do you know what I mean? And things like governments and unlivable wages.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And to add to our discussion, we have Richard Maddow joining us from COC TV's branch in Afghanistan.
Mr. Maddow, welcome to COC TV DC. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you.
And how has your perception of corruption changed?
Well, I used to think that there was one universal definition of corruption. I used to think that corruption was very easy to pinpoint and target. However, corruption is hard to counter and define, because there's so many different cultures that have norms that are different than ours. Now, corruption has so many angles to look at from, and when one aspect, such as low wages for government employees, is tackled, another can easily spring up and be a problem. Now, the problem of tackling grand corruption is that if one wants to make a difference, a complete restructuring of society must be implemented to establish clean institutions, invigorate the citizenry, and establish a free and active press. These changes are very hard to implement if those that live in the country are being oppressed by those in power already and cannot advocate for themselves. And many times in places such as Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, and Morocco, newly freed governments have a tendency to fall back into authoritarianism if they're not given the proper guidance to create these new and better institutions.
Well said, Mr. Maddow. And thank you for the clip of American University. How did you feel about the students' responses?
Now, the American University students are the brightest I've ever seen, and their responses about how money plays a huge role in the influence of corruption was spot on. I think that the remedies are very interesting as well, as using internal auditing can be a way to trace the money and stop their governments from stealing from people.
Wow, thank you, Mr. Maddow. Right, as per drivers of corruption, I want to start by discussing what we see the most obvious forms of corruption, because that is the easier ways to identify the sources and drivers. Greed, for example, is a major driver for financial corruption. The desire to become rich and powerful can definitely be a driver for individuals, and they will then become corrupt, whether it be those on the highest level or those right in the middle, the government employees and police officers. Greed is something found within us all, and with the rich wanting to get richer and the poor wanting to compete, definitely corruption will play a part in that.
Top-down or bottom-up corruption, it works both ways.
In addition to that, prejudice is also a very important aspect of corruption. When a government official feels like they can abuse their power and harm their own citizens for their own gain, the precursor to that is the mentality that their citizens are worth less than the official. Because those in power can take advantage of people, they will, without the rule of law that protects the people and those who are at risk of being taken advantage of.
So, what would you say are effective ways to combat this issue?
Strong legal institutions such as independent courts, a strong constitution, and an active citizenry are vital to ensuring governments remain accountable to their people. With lack of oversight, governments and other institutions cannot be held accountable for their actions.
And that's why we see the Catholic Church remain powerful during the sexual abuse scandals.
And also how the UN was able to hide their role in spreading cholera to Haiti for so long.
Exactly. These powerful institutions that most people believe are good and just can just easily fall victim to corruption without other agencies and organizations to check their power. The problem in Afghanistan specifically is that corruption is so widespread and that it's become a systemic problem that cripples U.S. and Afghan efforts to bring stability to the region.
Right, and there seems to be a narrative of corruption running rampant only in developing or poor nations. But here on COC TV, we are different in the mainstream media.
And with that, thank you, Richard Maddow, for joining us today.
Say hello to the COC TV over in Afghanistan, will you?
Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak about this topic on COC TV DC.
Right. To continue our discussion, I just want to bring up issues of low government transparency, low civil participation in government, and lack of press freedom. Those can definitely be drivers of corruption, whether it be state-sponsored media just spewing out propaganda or harassing the press actively, presenting them as enemies of the people in order to cover up the government's wrongdoings. We can definitely see this both in developed and underdeveloped nations, and really in a various amount of different kinds of settings.
I can see that. But it's also very important to focus on some remedies of corruption.
That's right.
For years, countries around the world have been searching for ways to combat corruption. While some countries have made significant progress in their fight against corruption, others have not been as successful. First of all, one of the most impactful remedies of corruption is transparency. According to Anti-Corruption Transparency International, countries successful at curbing corruption have a long tradition of government openness, freedom of the press, transparency, and access to information. Access to information increases the responsiveness of government bodies while simultaneously having a positive effect on the levels of public participation in a country.
Right, and just looking at the index, countries with the lowest amount of corruption really, like New Zealand and Denmark and Finland, all encourage free speech and have freedom of the press.
Right. And this could be due to the fact that a more aware and informed population is better able to report and counter corrupt actions. For example, a 2011 empirical study published in the European Journal of Political Economy supported this theory and found that increased awareness of corruption through the internet, measured through corruption-related internet searches, correlated with a decreased instance of corruption in numerous countries.
Right, and obviously not every country has been successful in having a transparent government. That's a lot to do with the leaders and their attitudes towards corruption and towards transparency.
Yes, and on that note, on the 2017 Corruption Perception Index, the region of sub-Saharan Africa contained the greatest amount of low-scoring countries. In addition to this, the countries that performed poorly on the index were led by leaders that ran for office with a campaign that focused on anti-corruption policies. But when they reached office, they never actually lived up to their pledges to deliver corruption-free services to their citizens. We saw this with former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, when she admitted in her final State of the Nation address that her administration did not deliver on any of its anti-corruption pledges. Her tenure as president was filled with instances of nepotism, illegal contracts, and impunity for her cabinet ministers.
Oh my.
In order to help combat corruption, countries need to create anti-corruption sanctions that will be followed up on and enforced.
Right, and in addition to having an anti-corruption sanctions placed, it's also very important to inspire grassroots movements and organizations focusing on anti-corruption. And that can only come after the public is aware and educated about the grand corruption taking place in their country that they might know of, but also trying to combat the petty corruption going on, that's something they have to deal with on a daily basis, right? And we have to also make efforts to make sure that they don't just take this as a norm. Organizations can show people that there are other options and it's not just about seeking out or paying bribes.
Yes, of course. And with that, we are going to close today's segment.
Thank you and good night to everybody at home. And remember to tune in to the special report on Thursday night on corruption within American University. I am Andrea Cooper.
And this is Willa Blitzer.
Remember, always say no to corruption.
Corruption is in the human heart. And, money corrupts all. And it's been like that since the beginning. The only way we can solve this problem of corruption that's inside of all of us with desires that lead us astray is just universal brotherness of all peoples. So that's my message.